Hey everyone, my name is Christina. I am in my final semester of my MSW program, and today I'm going to be presenting on the group proposal that I created during this class. I'm going to be presenting Resilience in Rural Utah, a virtual dialectical behavior therapy or DBT skills group for LGBTQ plus youth. So this is a group that I came up with because I am very passionate about mental health for LGBTQ plus youth. As someone who is very involved in the queer community and identifies as part of the queer community, the mental health concerns that youth are facing are very difficult in an environment, especially recently, that is very oppressive. And here in Utah, there are a unique combination of barriers that affect LGBTQ plus youth, and that is one of the reasons I wanted to focus on them for my group proposal. So in Utah, there's lack of community and family support for queer youth. There's a lack of access to affirming mental health care as well as medical health care. But there's also this kind of like third part that is a little unique to Utah, I feel. And it's that Utah's culture and values are very heavily influenced by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the LDS Church has historically held very negative and oppressive views toward the LGBTQ plus community. These impact youth at an individual level by experiencing discrimination, hate crimes, those kind of individual level pieces, but also at the meso level, there's a lack of access to funding for programs that are specific for queer youth. And at the macro level, there has been an influx of legislature that negatively impacts queer youth, which leads to further isolation, discrimination, and mental health symptoms like suicidality, depression, and anxiety. Kind of an example of that is there was recently a bill passed, I believe it's House Bill 280, that puts limits on school therapists and school social workers on what topics they are allowed to discuss with students. And it's set by parents. So if you have parents who are invalidating of a queer youth's identity, they can go to that school therapist or school social worker and say, you are not allowed to talk about these topics. And if they do, then they're essentially in violation of the law. When looking at the specific mental health needs of queer youth in Utah, the Trevor Project did a survey of the mental health needs in 2024 and found that 42% of youth in Utah had seriously considered suicide, and 11% had attempted suicide. Queer youth also reported that 66% had experienced symptoms of anxiety, 53% experienced symptoms of depression, and 66% reported that they had experienced discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that's kind of where this like minority stress piece comes in. So experiencing discrimination, experiencing, all of these things adds to another layer of stress and anxiety and depression and symptoms that queer youth can have. So when I was creating this group, one of the big questions was like, why DBT? Why dialectical behavior therapy? I have been learning a lot about DBT in my practicum. It's something that I think is like really interesting. There's so much research about it. It's been adapted for a lot of different populations and mental health issues. It was originally created to address like suicidality and self-harm in individuals who had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And since then, like they've done a lot of studies and applications and modifications to curriculum to adapt it for other populations. With the LGBTQ plus community, I think these kind of 4 parts are very important for them to learn about, to practice, to build their skills in. These are all things that can help queer youth learn to not just like survive, but to thrive in an environment and a culture that invalidates them, that where they are experiencing discrimination, where they feel like they don't have community. I think these skills would be very beneficial for them. If, a queer youth lives in Salt Lake or Davis County or Utah County, there are some resources, Salt Lake more than others because it's more progressive. Um, but once you get into kind of like the rural areas, there is not much. And so that's why I think a virtual format, while that has its challenges, would be the most beneficial because you could reach a wider range of queer youth in rural areas where they don't have access to resources. It would be for youth ages 13 to 17. It would be two parts. So first part would be 15 weeks, second part would be 16 weeks. I realize that is like a very long time, but I think it's important with this, DBT Steps A curriculum. It's 30 modules. I think each module deserves to have the time spent on it to make sure that youth are understanding it, they're digesting it, they're learning how to practice it, they're asking questions, especially also with a virtual format. Going back again. One of the important parts too is taking the DBT Steps A curriculum, but also applying it directly to the experiences of queer youth. So kind of, and like an example would be, how do you use Wisebind when you're responding to bullying or discrimination or rejection from family or invalidation of your queer identity or dysphoria? How do we make sure, we're not just like being reactive or suppressing it? Like, how are we thinking about it, balancing it, and moving forward? The expected outcomes of this group, I would expect to see a reduction in suicidal ideation and behaviors, a reduction in symptoms associated with anxiety and depression, and improved capacity for distress tolerance. And sorry if I'm talking very fast. I just am like very passionate about this, and I've recorded this like 5 times, and I keep going up to like 10 minutes. And I think evaluation, so important. You need to be able to measure what progress you're making, what's working, what's not working. I think, doing any kind of combination of these measures would be beneficial at the beginning. So before part 1, after part 1, I think it would be beneficial to do it before part 2 as well, to see if there's any change, with the post-test from part 1. If there's a gap before part 2 begins, how are they able to maintain those skills when they're not meeting with their group, when they're not in their social support groups? And then again, completing it after part 2. I think, while virtual platforms kind of have their own challenges, I think it's really important to make skills and tools accessible to everyone. I think this kind of DBT group targeted towards the needs and experiences of queer youth in Utah would be really beneficial and would help reduce rates of self-harm and suicidal ideation, anxiety, depression. And it would also provide them with social connection, connecting with people who are having similar experiences to them, who have similar identities, understanding that they're not alone, even though they're in these really isolated rural communities where they probably don't have people who support them. I think the DBT framework would be a huge asset to them and would increase their capacity for resiliency, and be able to face oppression and minority stress and people who invalidate their identities, and be able to stand firm and strong and advocate for themselves and think dialectically about all of these things. I think rural youth and any rural community often typically gets forgotten about, but I think LGBTQ youth in rural Utah deserve access to tools and support that build their resilience, that build their capacity to not just survive, but to thrive and embrace their identities and embrace who they are and build community. So that is my group proposal, and these are all of my references. All right, thanks everyone.